Hello there and welcome to the Secrets of Organ Playing podcast. I'm your host, Vidas Pinkevičius. Today's guest is my longtime friend, Swedish organ expert and organist Göran Grahn, who is active as organ consultant, making programs for restorations and new building of pipe organs. He is also the secretary of International Society of Organbuilders, a society of around 300 organ builders worldwide, and a curator of Museum of Musical Instruments and Manuscripts, Stiftelsen Musikkulturens Främjande. In this conversation, Göran shares his insights about the Swedish organ culture, instruments, history, style, and music. Let's go to the show and find out all there is to know about Swedish organ culture. So, Göran, I'm so delighted that we're finally having this conversation. I was waiting for it about a few months to arrange this conversation, and it's finally here. And I hope people around the world will get so much inspiration of this conversation, because you, Göran, are a person who knows everything about Swedish organs and Swedish organ culture, isn't it?
Well, maybe not absolutely everything, but I know some, yes.
So thank you so much, Göran, for joining the show, and welcome.
Yes, I'm very glad to be with you.
Wonderful. So let's start a little bit about your background. I wonder, always try to ask people how they first fall in love with the organ, you know. Did you remember these childhood days when somebody introduced you to the pipe organ? Can you share the story with us?
Yeah, so I actually came in contact with sort of organ-like things when I started first year in school, because in every classroom in Sweden there was one of those reed organs, harmoniums, and that one was played every morning, where we had to sing hymns because it was obligatory with the morning prayer every morning in the classrooms in those days. And so I thought that was an interesting instrument. And later on, when the school finished for the term, we had the little service in the church. And then I remember the headmaster was playing on this very, very big thing up on the gallery. And I thought this was a fantastic thing. So that's my first contact. And actually, when I already then, as a 7-year-old, fell in love with the organ.
Fantastic. 7 years old, right? That's the most curious age of any child, right? Whether you start painting or drawing or dancing or playing instruments, singing. And I'm very glad that this first pipe organ experience happened so early in your childhood, right?
I remember I made paper pipes and put them up on some sort of board, and then I had a mouth harmonica which I played with the other hand, or at the same time.
Oh, so you were not only musically inclined, but also you had some engineering genes in you, right? You wanted to find out how things worked, right? And build yourself paper pipes. Wonderful.
Paper pipes, yes.
Wonderful. And what happened next, Göran? How did you learn to play the organ?
Well, I started a little bit with piano when I was little, and then my interest took a little break, I would say, somewhere from, let's say, maybe 8-9 years old up till about 13 years old. I was more into trams and trains during those 10 years. And then at some point I was in some kind of church youth club, and they asked us if we had seen a pipe organ or a church organ ever in our lives. So we hadn't, of course. We were all invited up to the church and come up and see the organ and also try the organ. And then I played a little bit of piano. And so I was allowed to try the organ for the first time. And then I was absolutely sold on the organ. And I remember then I wanted to start playing the organ, but then they said, oh no, you have to play another 2 years of piano before you can start with the organ. And I think I've never been so sad in my life as that day. So nowadays I always say, let any young children start playing the organ.
Right, regardless whether they have piano experience or not, right?
Yeah.
Regardless whether their legs are long enough, right, to reach
So
the pedals.
now in Sweden, actually, they make special pedal boards for children, so they can reach the pedals even with short legs.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And the Swedish organ culture, of course, you first get acquainted with this local tradition, right? And I'm very curious when you started later travel in your experience. Can you describe a little bit the Swedish organ flavor, if we can say that? What is the main characteristic of the Swedish organs?
Well, I would say the normal traditional Swedish historic organ is a very singing organ. It's used for congregational singing with very vocal voicing, and the tradition as such from the beginning of Swedish history is a slight bit complicated. It first started with medieval, so the oldest medieval organs that still remain, or remains of medieval organs, are in Sweden, came from the island Gotland, and those two organs are displayed in the Historical Museum in Stockholm. So one is from 1377, and the other one is from around 1400, and the one from 1400 already also has action and wind chests preserved.
So basically it's what, 14th century, right?
Yes.
700 years ago almost, right?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
like the beginning of written down organ music. We have, remember the old manuscript called Robertsbridge Codex, Codex,
Yeah.
Italian origin, but from English library. And that's probably, you're talking about the early Swedish organ, which easily can accommodate those medieval sounds, right?
Yeah.
So
And the oldest organ is actually signed even from somebody called Werner from Brandenburg, 1377. So it was actually somebody from Germany who came to Gotland to build the organ. Of course, Gotland came into different nationalities and different conquerors' hands during the history. So I'm not really sure. It probably might not have been Swedish in those days. But anyway, we have also other examples of a medieval organ culture in Sweden. So there were quite many churches and cathedrals who had organs very early.
Right.
So it's definitely something that has a very long history back in Sweden.
Wonderful. And you mentioned they already have in 1377, did they have organ stop action sort of, or was
No,
it
these two organs that are preserved, those were blockwerk organs.
so they didn't.
Organ, yes.
So only one color basically would have been possible to play.
And they have something like 4 or 5 ranks of the quints and octaves, and and also the keyboard preserved, or the keyboard slots show a rather primitive, old-fashioned keyboard before the standardized keyboard from the 16th century and onwards.
Wonderful. And I assume there were no pedals at that time?
No, oh yes,
with pedals.
Yes, with pedals. Yeah.
So can you speculate, Göran, a little bit? What kind of pedal passages can be played or could have been played at that time?
I think definitely probably Cantus Firmus tunes or something like that, because the pedals are rather primitive, so you can only play with your toe, this little thing sticking out, and then you can play with your toe on that pedal. So probably they played sort of long notes like Cantus Firmus or something like that.
So people who are in love with Max Reger's music should be disappointed, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. or do the pedal solos or something like that.
Right.
But actually, if we go a little bit further on in the Swedish organ history, in the 17th century, other organ builders from Germany came to Sweden and built basically the same kind of organ as they had in northern Germany. It was definitely imported at the end of the 16th century, when Hans Heinrich Karman came from Flensburg to Sweden to build various organ, among others the big organ in the Uppsala Cathedral around 1600, which was a big organ with a 32-foot pedal case principle. And unfortunately that organ burnt down after some years, but then later on his son Johann Niklas Karman, who is actually called the father of Swedish organ builder, who lived from the end of the 17th century to the beginning of the 18th century, and he built a new organ in 1730 in Uppsala Cathedral, which survived until 1871, so there are only some photographs left of that organ. But one of his organs is very well preserved in Lövstabruk, in the village of Lövstabruk, a bit north of Uppsala. A big organ with 28 stops, 2 manuals and pedal, right in the middle of the forest. Because the family De Geer, who came from Belgium, who was in charge of these iron works in this village, he wanted to show off how rich he was. He had on this really fancy organ put up in this church in this village, and it was later forgotten and rediscovered in the 1930s. So it's one of our real gems in Sweden.
So Lövstabruk, it's a fantastic Baroque organ, late Baroque basically, right? Organ which can be played for example music of post-Bach era, right? Pre-classical or classical even music, right?
Absolutely, yes. You can play very easily, for instance, Krebs, or also you can play Bach also. It has a separate pedal division without couplers, so it has the full specification in the pedal. And there's a Ripositiv and Hauptwerk, and you can actually play good trios, or you can play Krebs or anything like that. You could call this organ a typical Rococo organ. It has a very elaborate decoration, and it's also quite modern because it has chromatic C to C3 in the compass, which is
okay.
1728, rather advanced for being out in the middle of the countryside in Sweden.
Right. So up to this point, most of the Swedish organs had short octave, I would assume, right?
So then they had short octave, yes.
Can you describe our listeners what the thing is this short octave? What is its function?
The short octave is actually that you don't have any semitones down in the bass. So the lowest key you see on the keyboard looks like an E, but actually that E is actually a C, and the F sharp is a D, and the G sharp is an E. And then you have to go back again and play the F and then G, A, and then after A only you have a semitone with B flat and then B and C. So that's also, especially in small organs, it was used quite frequently because then you don't need any pedal when you have those notes, because you can reach those notes quite easily with your fingers. So very often organs without pedals had also short octave.
Right. I remember back in 2000, when we first met, Göran, in your house, you have this wonderful, we would say Latvian organ, right? A little bit Latvian style organ that Jānis Kalniņš, our common friend, built for you, and it also has the short octave. And I remember it was my first experience with this kind of layout, and I couldn't figure out my fingering. And you were so fluent with this and wonderful. So it takes practice, right?
It takes practice. It's a matter of training. But for that music composed in those days in the 17th century, actually it's very convenient with the short octaves because there is written for the short octaves. You can easily reach the notes and don't need any pedal for help.
Wonderful.
So if I continue a little bit of the Swedish organ history, then pupils of Johann Niklas Karman built lots of organs later on in the 18th century. Olof Hedlund, Gren and Stråle, and Olof Svan. Then there was also a second school of organ building in Linköping in Sweden, started by Jonas Wistenius, who actually studied in Königsberg with Kaspari and Morsengel. So he came back to Sweden and started his own organ workshop in about 1740 and built organs up to he died, and then his pupil Per Sjölin took over the workshop. But then, of course, so they built some very nice, you can say, Rococo, early classical organs, but basically some kind of Baroque. style as well. So there are lots of good examples of these organs still preserved in Sweden.
So Jonas Vistenius, through the link with Johann Sigismundas Pari, I believe, and Mosengel from Königsberg, it's the direct link with Lithuanian organ culture tradition, right? So
Absolutely.
Can you elaborate a little bit our Baltic ties also, Göran?
Yes, of course. In those days, the Baltic Sea actually connected the countries, as is partly the case today also. And I think that probably, I'm not sure, Jonas Vistenius, it's quite possible that he had followed his master maybe into Lithuania and into Poland as well to build organs. We have no written evidence that he did so, but at least we can see some features of the style of the organs that have some resemblance between the traditions, and a bit of the sound as well also, even though there are some other ingredients also in the Baltics, but there are definitely connections.
Mm-hmm. And through Baltic culture, it's how we first met, right? I remember yes, I visited you in Sweden first, but we have to mention to our listeners that you were in Lithuania many times before, and in the Baltics also, that you know all three Baltic languages, right? And Latvian and Estonian and Lithuanian, and it was so amazing to hear to speak our native language out of the Swedish mouth.
Yes, and it started actually in the beginning of the 1980s when I visited a record shop in Helsinki where they were selling these Estonian and Latvian and Lithuanian organ records. And I realized, there are organs in these countries that were completely closed off by the Soviet Union. And I thought I will probably never be able to go to these places, but at least I can get these records and listen to them. I found that was really interesting, and I'm sure that there could be lots of valuable organs around in these countries. So then suddenly when it all opened up and people started coming over to Sweden, then I got some contacts and started off in Estonia, and then from 1992 to Lithuania, met Rimantas Guchas in Lithuania, and then later on I met Jānis Kalniņš in Latvia and other organ builders in all the three countries. And then it started first with Estonian because one could only speak German, the other only English. So I thought I had to learn some Estonian to be able to take part in discussions. And then I came to Lithuania and Rimanta said, you like Estonia better than us, don't you? So I have to learn your language as well. So a friend of mine wanted to start to learn Lithuanian, so we went to the university. And then I got to know people in Latvia and they said, you're not our friend if you don't learn Latvian. So some years I actually studied all the three languages parallel. So one day of each language.
So, Göran, you are one of the two Swedish people who speaks all Baltic languages. I know. The other, the second one being Jonas Öhmanen, right?
Yes.
Right. The famous.
He has a few more languages than I do because he's now helping a lot of people in Ukraine. So I'm sure he speaks Ukrainian also.
That's true. So wonderful. But the Baltic people, Lithuanians, Latvians, and Estonians, they don't usually learn their neighboring countries' languages. It's strange, isn't it?
It's a bit strange maybe, but of course it's maybe not so easy. For Lithuanians it could be quite easy to learn Latvian, but to learn Estonian is quite difficult because it's a completely different language family. So, but I would say that Lithuanians and Latvians could understand 50% by written text if they read written text, but of course the pronunciation is very different also.
Yeah.
So
very closely related languages. Great, Göran. And going back to the Swedish organ culture, we have to remember probably what kind of religion did you have, or do you have the most? Lutheran, right?
Yes, most Lutheran, because when the Reformation was started by Gustav Vasa, it took him about 100 years to carry through the Reformation. But then it was more or less done by force. I think the Swedish didn't really want to become Lutheran. They were Catholic, and for a short time we had also Zygmunt Vasa from the Polish Lithuanian kingdom as our king. So we could also have been joined with them. But anyway, it was a political thing with the Reformation. So from 1593 and onwards, it was only allowed to be Lutheran when you were in Sweden. Otherwise, you would be thrown out of the country. And it was also a state church. So the state had to decide everything. They were the officials out in the villages. The priest was the official. Mm-hmm. So also the singing was regulated and the music was regulated. So they decided later on in the 19th century when they introduced a new hymn book. They said also we need organs in every church so we can bring the singing in order in the Lutheran church in Sweden. Mm-hmm. And so around 1800 or beginning of 19th century, they had run out of organ builders because they had all died, Schörlin and Schwan and all those. So they sent 2 talented young men to Germany to learn organ builder. One was Per Zacharias Strand and the other one was Gustav Andersson. And they were sent out to learn organ building, and they brought with them a kind of post-Silberman style of organ building to Sweden, which was a bit more romantic and a bit more moonshine-like in the sound. And they built quite many organs around Sweden until they died in the middle of the 19th century. And then they were short of organ builders again, so they sent a new talented young man, Per Larsson Åkerman, to Belgium and to France and to Germany to learn the latest in organ building. So he brought a late romantic, slightly French-German-inspired organ with flute harmonique and Vasselest and such stops with him to Sweden. So that was still yet another jump in Swedish organ tradition.
Mm-hmm. So it was more like Germanic influence, right?
Yes.
And later on it became more French, right? A little bit different culture. Was the music also influenced by those 2 countries as well?
To begin with, I think it was very much improvisation. They played the chorales and the church music and improvised, or they played a military march or something like Napoleon's march over the Alps. They played in the 19th century often as postludes.
Right.
But later on, of course, the solo organ tradition started. But mainly, I would say, in the 20th century, it developed really very much. There were some composers already from the 18th century, but most of it was rather 19th and early 20th century when it really started off with solo music and organ education in the conservatories and so on. Because before that, the school teacher and the organist was usually the same person in the village, and he could play some organ and teach the children and do some vaccinations and things like that.
Fantastic, Göran. Swedish culture is so rich with these different sounds. I think when we talk about early 19th century, that's still Baroque style, I think, instrument, right? Or late Baroque Rococo style, yes. Like in Lovstabrook, right? Maybe. Yeah. Something like that. It amazes me that so many 8-foot foundation stops you have in each division, and just like in central Germany, probably, right? Something like that. Therefore, music by Krebs sounds spectacularly well on these situations, right?
Yes. Like the record that Bill Porter recorded in Gammalkil.
Nobody can forget this fantastic recording of Klavierübung. It's a gem, really fantastic gem.
Yes. And then later on, of course, when the romantic style developed into the 20th century and into the pneumatic area like everywhere else in Europe, but still quite sort of rather typical Swedish flavor of sound, quite rather stringy principles, lots of flutes and so on. But later on in the 1930s, the organ reform movement from Germany took on very, very heavily in Sweden, because there were some organists like Henry Wehrmann and Alf Linder and Gotthard Anér who were really sort of forefighters for the German organ reform, which meant also that very many very valuable romantic organs were scrapped in the 1950s and 60s when they had lots of money. and they wanted this. They thought that we will never play romantic organ music. So we have some thousands of these very, very screamy neo-Baroque organs that were built in those record years, so to speak.
Right. And were there any damage done to historical instrument as well during that period?
Not so much during that period, because there was one old doctor who was interested in the organ, who voluntarily went around to all the churches in Sweden. His name was Einar Erisi, and he made a catalogue of all the preserved historical organs before 1860 in Sweden, and did research in the archives. And whenever such an organ was threatened, he said, "Can you please let me play for a Sunday so I can show you what this organ can do?" And in that way he preserved and saved, rescued very many of these organs. Because in the 1930s and 40s, very often they pneumatized the old organs, and maybe kept two stops or something in the organ case. But from the 1950s, 60s and onwards, the protection of these organs started to be legislated and so on. And that has, of course, been moved later on to later style of organs as well. But so that means that we have about 250 organs built before 1860 in Sweden.
Do you know the approximate number of total pipe organs in Sweden?
I think it could be something like between 3,500 and 4,000 organs altogether. It's hard to count every little positive somewhere, but
right. And how many people do live in Sweden totally? In total?
Now we're coming up to 10 million.
10 million? Oh, okay.
So we're a country twice the size of Great Britain and the population of London.
Great. Fantastic. And you have 4,000 or 3,000 organs. Great. And what's the situation now? Are they mostly well preserved or protected?
Generally, they were preserved. Yes, and protected, taken care of also. In some places, some of them are still in rather bad condition, but they're slowly getting restored one after the other. Of course, a problem in later times have been the sale of electronic organs. Unfortunately, some organists think it's very convenient that you can transpose and you can do whatever you like, and that's a little bit of a problem that we have. So in some churches, actually, this pipe organ, if there has been a bad one, has been scrapped, and unfortunately, many of these rather bad neo-Baroque organs have sometimes been replaced by the electronic organs. But there are also cases where a church bought an electronic organ and later replaced it with a pipe organ. So
yes. And of course, Göran, it's thanks to you and thanks to Niklas Fredriksson, right, who are basically two people responsible for expertise for historical organs. You are both organ experts, right? Can you elaborate a little bit? What are your duties in this situation? What do you do?
Well, I'm myself. I'm only functioning as a private enterprise organ consultant. So I am being hired by various parishes to make restoration programs or evaluation or something like that of organs. I don't have any official position in Sweden as organ expert. My main profession is to be curator in the Nydal collection in Stockholm, the Stiftelsen Musikkulturens Främjande. We have about 550 old musical instruments and 2,000 music manuscripts and letters and of composers. So we have, but with that base, of course, I have also developed my knowledge in organ and restoration of organs. So I have a number of projects, and I've had a number of projects of very, very different kind of organs. So everything from 18th century organs to pneumatic or to even neo-Baroque organs that needed to be preserved. So I have built up, by experience, I could say, quite a good expertise after some years.
It's a little bit off topic, but very much connected. I know Sweden have many clavichords as well, right?
Yes.
And they are in the past were used mostly for organists, right? To play and practice at home. It's very interesting. What is the state now? Do people enjoy playing and hearing clavichord music today?
I think that there are also quite some people, and there were some years ago also clavichord building courses, so people could actually build their own clavichord, and there were quite many who came to these courses. And I remember here in the museum we had a clavichord concert once with 80 people. That's full house in our place, listening to clavichord. So I think there are quite many who are interested in clavichord. And of course in Sweden the clavichord survived very long into the 19th century, and were actually built parallel with the square pianos until about 1835. So we have some of these very big clavichords by Lindholm and Söderström and Nordqvist and all those.
What about pedal clavichord? Do you have those too?
Not really, no. I haven't seen any Swedish example. There were more in Germany, I think.
More in Germany, right.
Yeah. Actually, the
Of
pedal
course.
board as such, most of the Swedish organs in the countryside actually had a very little pull-down pedal, maybe 1.5 octave or something. So the Löstabruk and some others are really exceptions in the 18th century. Only later on, by the end of the 19th century, in the beginning of the 20th century, it was more standardized with the normal pedal board. But before then, it was usually maybe 1.5 octave pull-down pedal.
Wonderful, Göran. You've given us a very short, brief but very condensed view of Swedish organ culture. But can we for the ending of our conversation touch a little bit on the composers, right? For our listeners, what kind of composers should our listeners be aware of if they want to play Swedish music as well today?
There is, of course, one place in Visby. There is what is called the Visby tablature, which is a very old manuscript with organ music. I think that's music from very different composers, and that was played on the organ that is now being reconstructed in the Visby Cathedral from 1599. But then otherwise, in the 18th century, first in the 17th century, we had the family Düben, who were organists in the German church. So they collected lots of music, they did lots of music and composed also music for the organ. So the Düben collection in the Uppsala University Library has lots of interesting music from the 17th century, like Monteverdi and Schütz and all sorts of things like that.
And Anders Düben was a student of Svelling, right? Jan
Yes.
Petersson Svelling. That's how this Svelling tradition was transferred to Sweden as well, I think.
Exactly, yes. And then later on it was the organist in the Stockholm nowadays cathedral, but then the big church, that was Ferdinand Sellbell. There were both father and son Sellbell who wrote quite elaborate 18th century organ music. And then there are some also from the later, but I would say the main part of the Swedish organ music would be rather end of 19th century and beginning of 20th. Up to the middle of the 20th century, we had a long romantic tradition which ended with Gustav Hägg and Otto Olsson and many others, other romantic. Oskar Lindberg is also one of, and he died in 1955, so that's mid-20th century. And there is lots of nice organ music from that period, which is getting increasingly popular around the world as well. And then, of course, right after that, the new, you could call it style, the Neusachlichkeit took on in Sweden. So most of the organ music that was written from the 1950s and onwards were quite modern and up to Torsten Nilsson, who made big clusters and things. And I think nowadays the organ music has gone back a little bit more to the traditional lines, but we had a very experimental period in the beginning of the 1960s.
Like Bengt Hambreus, right?
Yes, Bengt Hambreus was one of our big. Then also Karl-Erik Welin, who improvised a lot on the organ, and Torsten Nilsson is one of our greater organ composers from the 1960s and 70s. And that is quite an expansive period in Swedish, and that came very much together with the organ reform movement also. And then, of course, by the mid-1980s, people had had enough of these mixtures and small regals and things. So then the people started playing César Franck and romantic music again. and the romantic organs started slowly coming back, and also organs inspired from the early 19th century in Sweden, and reconstructions also of historical organs, so that it has come back to a little bit more traditional style now.
Fantastic, Göran. I'm so grateful to you, to your generosity of sharing those ideas throughout the world, right? And I hope you will continue your work of very generous and doing things that matter to a lot of people. Thank you so much. And
you're welcome.
I hope to speak to you.
I hope that people see some.
Wonderful. And before we close, can you direct our listeners to some place online where they can connect with you and your work?
Yes, they can come to the museum website, which is nydalkoll.se, nydalkoll.se. You will probably put it out in writing also on your page.
Absolutely, yeah.
And the other page they can get in touch with me is my organ consultancy page, which is orgelkonsult.se.
Wonderful.
So they can find me there also, and I'm happy to be in contact with anybody who likes. And also you can search me on Facebook, of course, and also our museum on Facebook.
And of course, we have to mention that you are active in International Society of Organbuilders, right?
Yes,
I saw you are the secretary, right?
Yes.
Of that wonderful organization which unifies organ builders of entire entire world, right? And so that's amazing that the organ builders also are united, and you are one of them taking part of this.
Exactly. So that's how things are.
Wonderful. So have a splendid evening in Sweden, and wonderful, creative and brave year ahead of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Göran. Hejdå.
G'day. Hejdå.
If you liked this conversation, I encourage you to visit my blog Secrets of Organ Playing at organduo.lt, where you will find lots of insights, practical advice and training for every area of organ playing. You can subscribe to this blog for free to get your daily dose of inspiration and to be the first to know when any of my future podcasts roll out. I hope to help you reach your dreams in organ playing. I'm Vidas Pilkevičius. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you online really soon.